If you take a look at the chat window, um, thank you, Jamie. She's posted links to our class survey. So please, if you have time, fill that out and give your feedback. We want to add new courses, make this one as good as it can be. I don't assume that I have, um, the best class design or things that are most useful to people. So some ideas that we've had in the past have been, sometimes these texts can get a little bit difficult to read through. So we've considered starting like a complete beginners topics or a totally different type of course. So we're open to doing that. Um, but the more feedback we get from people, the easier it is for me to try to design something that's useful. If it were up to me, I'd say, oh, let's look into 6th century Confucian texts and their influence on Chinese culture at the time that Kukai visited China, because it's just fascinating. But it may not be interesting to everyone. So please let me know what you're interested in. I've said before, this class started. Um, there's Here's some background. So this class started as a way to actually started 9 years ago almost. Um, when I was stationed in Hawaii at the temple there, I started as an assistant minister, thinking, well, everyone here was raised Buddhist, so they will know, um, there'd be very, very informed Buddhists. And I found the opposite. People had just grown up with it, had followed along, and there were a lot of questions. So I started a class that went through the service, point by point. Why is it in the service, and um, what should we understand from it? Where did it come from? That kind of thing, so that people would have a little bit more detail. And that ballooned into seminars and more classes, and that's been going on now for I can't believe it's 9 years. So it started in 2010 or 2011. So when I came back to Portland, we were renting space at a local Presbyterian church that found itself with too many facilities and not enough parishioners. So they rented out space to other groups. The only time they had available was Thursday at this hour. So we have continued for since 2013, I guess, at this time. So other people have come along and suggested we record it and put it on YouTube. So I figured out how to do that, and so now that's available there. Um, so this has been from the beginning a process of kind of listening to what the need or interest is and trying to respond to that. So please do give your feedback, and we'll make um, additions and modifications. This is only useful if it's actually helpful. So if um, too much material is going over people's heads, or if they're bored with the material and they want something different, or if they have specific questions, we'll try to address that. So it's just sometimes try to balance people who are new to um, the Dharma talk and people who've been participating for years. So if that means creating a new class, I'm open to doing that. And thankfully, with technology, we're able to reach more people. So it's a whole new brave new world. So at any rate, thank you all for joining. Um, it's good to see um, all of your smiling faces represented through names on my screen. So um, I'm glad everybody, when I see you log in, it's good to know everyone's still doing well, and um, we're able to come together like this, and it's still a very difficult time. So I look forward to seeing you all, and it's it's good to be back. So we will pick up where we left off in the Awakening of Faith. So if you're following along with us in the PDF, it is page 46, and we left off right around the translator's note there. So I wanted to pick up there and elaborate on some of the points that are made in the translator's note, and then try to give a little bit more background to what's being discussed here. And as usual, if you have questions, please, whatever you're comfortable with, speak up, type it into the chat window, send me an email later, whatever you feel most comfortable with. So I do enjoy your feedback and questions. It helps me get a better sense for how people are thinking about the text. So we all come from different parts of the world and different backgrounds, and maybe what we would say is our situatedness is different. So how we hear the text or read it is going to be different. So sometimes you'll hear me point out things that potentially are problematic in translation. So those are things that occurred to me, but you may hear it differently. So, as organically as possible, we'll try to read through this together. So just to recap, we'll pick up with the translator's note. And if you see me looking over here, I'm looking at another screen with the text. So just so it must look strange on camera. So the translator's note there, the paramitas, requirements to be perfected by sentient beings who are potentially enlightened by bodhisattvas in order to attain enlightenment. They are means to be practiced by the Mahayanists in order to cross over from this shore, samsara, to the other shore of nirvana. The so-called six paramitas are most frequently encountered in Mahayana literature. They are charity, observance of precepts, patience, zeal, meditation, and wisdom. So I went through what the paramitas are last time. So this time I want to talk a little bit about how they fit with practice, understanding why they come up here. And for better or for worse, hang on to your seat to try to address current topics and how we can process what's going around us through the teaching. So the text goes on. It says, the type of paradoxical expression that we meet here can most frequently be found in the Perfection of Wisdom literature. To cite an example similar to the one in our text, a passage from the Diamond Sutra, which belongs to the body of the Perfection of Wisdom literature, says, so this is a translation. The Lord said, and again, sometimes somewhat problematic language, I don't think we would translate it this way now, so that it's the Buddha speaking. So the Buddha said, here's Subhuti. Someone who has set out in the vehicle of a bodhisattva should produce a thought in this manner. As many sentient beings as there are in the universe of beings, comprehended under the term beings, all these I must lead to nirvana, into that realm of nirvana which leaves nothing behind. And yet, although innumerable beings have thus been led to nirvana, no being at all has been led to nirvana. And why? If in a bodhisattva the notion of a being should take place, he could not be called a bodhi being. And why? He is not to be called a bodhi being in whom the notion of a self or of a being should take place, or the notion of a summer living soul or of a person. We don't talk like this, so I will try to retranslate to more modern English. So there's a line from the text on page 46, just a little bit above. And that line should, if you look up, give us a little bit more insight into what's being talked about here. So there's an outlook here being discussed, and it's the outlook of the Bodhisattva. And the line I'm talking about says, they took great vows, desiring to liberate all sentient beings through countless eons until the end of future time, for they regarded all sentient beings as they regarded themselves. So this is the line that kind of activates this portion of the text and why we're talking about Adhimitas. And this harkens back to the early teaching of the Buddha. And it's something we sometimes overlook when we're discussing things in the awakening of faith. And it's sometimes missed when we're even discussing the early teachings of the Buddha. And what I want to point out is when the Buddha taught the truth of dukkha, the truth of suffering, he didn't just leave it on the table and walk away. So he didn't say, oh, all life is suffering, and then sling his leather jacket over his shoulder and walk off towards his motorcycle and put on his sunglasses, say it, um, flick a cigarette, all life is suffering, and just leave. It wasn't presented in this manner, but it's often, I think, presented to us in this manner, kind of like uncaring or indifferent. So I want to dig into that a little bit. So the and I'll try to make the circle back to where we are in the text here. So the Buddha taught um, this second noble truth, the truth of suffering, and dukkha or suffering is really dissatisfaction, and it's dissatisfaction with the basics of life. It's not when we say suffering in English. Um, I'm always reminded of some like Edgar Allan Poe. You know, I'm trapped in a cellar, and someone has hatched a devious plan against me, and I'm being walled up, um, secretly. Um, something really difficult. So the Buddha actually described this in a much more approachable manner, which the word suffering doesn't really encapsulate. So the Buddha taught that, and I won't say suffering anymore, I'll say dukkha. Dukkha is not getting what you want, whether the want is something physical, like a product, or if it's something more ephemeral, like sensual touch, craving, contact, wanting a hug, um, wanting ice cream, wanting a relationship with another person, or wanting a title, or to be placed in a category, or not being placed in a category. Um, Something like, I want to be famous, or I want to be powerful, or I want to be part of XYZ profession. When I grew up, I want to be, when I was a little kid, I either wanted to be, apparently at age 5, my career choices were karate instructor or garbage collector, because those just looked like the coolest things that I'd ever seen. So that's what I wanted. Um, so not getting that profession, right? There's a sort of psychological itch that you hold on to this idea, then you don't get it. There's disappointment. This is dukkha, right? So if you use the word suffering, you probably wouldn't say the little kid who doesn't grow up to be the childhood idea of a profession, he's suffering now. That's not how we describe it. So when we use, when it's translated as suffering, it's very, is missing the mark a little bit. So um, the Buddha was talking about a type of thirst, all the different I wants that come up in life. And the wanting of them is dukkha. And when we don't get them, there is a type of discomfort. Um, at the high end of that discomfort, we could say there's pain, but there's a lot of low level discomfort or dissatisfaction, which also falls into this very broad basket of dukkha. Um, Not all of them are painful. And I think that's really more the Buddha's point. There's this agitation. It's a little bit inartful to just say suffering. It's uncomfortable. It could be an itch. It could be something inside you that you just isn't quite satisfied. Um, and dukkha can be not getting what you want. So you went to your favorite restaurant, you wanted ice cream, but they only had gelato. And so you have this like, oh, I'll tell you a story. Right before I left Hawaii, some members of the temple took me to a restaurant near Ala Moana Mall, and they have a special dessert with called honey toast, and I really enjoyed this toast with honey and ice cream. So the whole time I was looking forward, like, oh, I get to have the honey toast. Um, and there was a tsunami warning that night, and we finished eating, but the tsunami warning came, and they were like, everyone has to evacuate the restaurant. There's likely to be a tsunami. And part of me was thinking, well, like, well, how long are we talking? Because I need to get this honey toast, and do we have time? uh, I'll eat it quickly. And so they said, well, you can take it with you. And I thought, you know, fleeing a tsunami in 85-degree heat, running down the street just doesn't seem like satisfying. So I had dukkha at that moment when I didn't get my favorite dessert. I was like, oh, shucks, tsunami. So um, this isn't suffering. It was just a little bit of like, oh, okay. So this is why the Buddha said it's inevitable. We're always going to have these feelings. Um, you want, you're a teenager and you want designer jeans, and your parents come home with tough skin jeans from Sears. Does anybody remember those? I remember the Sears carry tough skins because if you happen to wear them, the kids at my school would tease you relentlessly. Um, and it was like thing to be avoided. You don't want um, tough skin at all, right? So, there would be disappointment, like, oh, I don't want to be seen in these, right? So this isn't suffering, right? You can't. These are definitely first world problems, but there's a bit of discomfort. This is all dukkha. Um, you get older and you think, oh, I'm going to marry someone rich and famous, and then you happen to marry someone who's successful and just you know well known in your community, and you think, oh, but so this is more common that we run into on a day to day basis. Um, so classically, dukkha is described as being away from those that you want to be around, right? So being separated from those you care about, and then being near the people that you don't want to be around, right? So some group of people or the kids that tease you for wearing the wrong jeans, you have to ride the bus with them. So you're like, "Ah." So this kind of discomfort, all these things fall into um, dukkha. Um, these are the more common manifestations. Of course, at the high end, we really are talking about, uh, not having appropriate food, clothing, shelter, starvation, imprisonment. The real things that we would classically think of as dukkha, as suffering. This also falls into this category of dukkha. Um, Understanding dukkha is a meditation in and of itself. Um, and so this is where the text, I'm going to go back to that line of the page on page 46. They took great vows, desiring to liberate all sentient beings through countless eons until the end of future time, for they regarded all sentient beings as they regarded themselves. So they took vows, they wanted to liberate sentient beings, and at the end of the sentence there, we get to find out with, why do they do that? Because they regard sentient beings as themselves. And this is the part that, again, is often missing, especially in, I think, Western texts, which present, you know, dukkha as this beatnik poet, rebel without a cause kind of throwaway statement. Oh, all life is suffering. Flicks a cigarette. This is this ultra cool guy who has this insight. You guys don't get it. It's not this way. It's something that the bodhisattva deeply feels and understands as an experience, and understands that it's shared not only by the aspiring bodhisattva, but it's shared by everyone that they come into contact with. Um, and it's something that they see as a deep manifestation. So for them, um, they don't see a limitation of this experience to only the people they care about. So they don't, in meditation, like, oh, there's dukkha. I feel it. My mom feels it. My dad feels it. My friends feel it. Okay. No, they see it everywhere. So when they're confronted with really ugly behavior, they see this person is experiencing dukkha. They're experiencing deep discomfort. Um, and that's how they see beings. They don't see them as label. They don't see them as, um, that person with, that falls along whatever spectrum of the political divide, or they have a particular yard sign or not, or they wear a particular hat or not, or, when I was at the protest, they were on one side or the other. They just see beings experiencing dukkha. So that's a very broad understanding. And as they understand that, they recognize that they want to change the situation. And then they recognize that it's not just themselves that experience, they want to change this experience for others as well. And why do they have that experience? They realize it because they can't fix their own experience of dukkha without fixing that experience for everybody else. So let's say it's a you know social justice issue. So let's say it's a social justice issue faced by the entire country. Um, you can't just fix it for yourself, right? You can't say, "Well, we got the laws changed in our town, problem solved." Right? No, because you'll turn on the news and you'll see something happen in another town, and it will affect you. Um, when you leave your town, then you're still subject to the injustice. So you try to, like, everybody needs the same thing, because you can't really um, be at peace until it's solved for everyone. So in this way, the bodhisattva sees their liberation as connected to the liberation of all other people. Um, but I think it's fair to ask, well, why is that? Why is mine connected to everybody else? How is it that my liberation is connected to your liberation? Why can't I just get enlightened and leave this mess behind? Um, you know, you look around and you say, this whole life thing is really messy. I don't have the time or skill to use the Marie Kondo method. I can't tidy up. I can't figure out what sparks joy and what doesn't. I'm just going to leave. I'm going to find a mountaintop or a cave. I'm going to get enlightened, and then I'm out. Why doesn't that work? Um, so maybe we can describe it this way. There's a mysterious power that comes with the insight that we all experience the same dukkha, right? We all experience this thing called life the same. So when you really have that insight, there's it does something to you, right? There's a mysterious power of shifting your focus from yourself to others, to wanting to liberate others, and that seeing that others have the same experience. That does something to you. There's a mysterious power in recognizing that we're all, if we do it alone, we can never be successful. We've never done it alone. No one's ever done anything alone. Did anybody give birth to themselves? Did you nurse yourself? Did you teach yourself in school? Right? We've never done anything alone, but we somehow think, oh, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and I became successful. Um, there's a mysterious power in the insight that comes from knowing that when we turn our back on the world, we haven't developed real compassion. So if we really do, you know, permanently run off and just, oh, I've got to get away, and we stay on the mountain. This world is just too messy. Um, we're running from problems, and that is a problem itself. So this brings up a whole bunch of additional questions, and I'm going to call these the yeah buts, and they all start with yeah, but. So yeah, but people don't want our help. They have their own faith. So what good is, cultivating this idea that we should help all sentient beings? Um, yeah, but no one here is Buddhist and they don't support my practice. I'm in this small town and nobody cares that I'm meditating. In fact, they're openly hostile. Uh, yeah, but your temple has a loud train, and I can't get enlightened there. It's too loud. I can't meditate. I need to go someplace quieter. Um, I can't get to the deepest states of meditation because every 5 minutes is this bell ringing. Now I'm wondering if you guys can hear the bell because it actually is ringing right now. So this is where skillful means comes in, and the question is, how do we fix dukkha? So how do you fix dukkha? You have to address your reaction to it. So it's not suffering. Dukkha actually isn't suffering. It's not suffering until you react to it. Um, so remember, the Buddha is not a god. He didn't create the rules. He just had deep insight into them. So he said, okay, first, one of these basic things that's inescapable is you want something or you want to be away from something, you can't, and that triggers an emotion. Later, he teaches you can change that. You can change that response. So earlier, I shared the story about wanting my ice cream, uh, but being foiled by a tsunami. Um, even at the time, I was laughing. I wasn't really suffering. I thought, oh, of course, um, you know, even nature will conspire against me getting ice cream. This is hilarious. So we can change our response to the perceived disappointment. So then we can avoid the suffering. Um, we can gain insight into how it functions, and we can overcome the emotional response, and then we don't experience suffering. Um, what the Buddha did was lay out these insights, how they functioned, and then set out practices for us to gain insight into how to liberate ourselves from the system. What the awakening of faith is saying, and what the Mahayana perspective is, in the process of that, you're going to realize, oh, wait, everybody is going through the same thing. And it's a bit hollow if I get out, but I leave everybody behind. And in fact, I'm not really free. I'm going to have some part of me is going to be stuck. So this is the kind of outline of the basic teaching. The problem we have today, so what makes us different from people in ancient times? The problem we have today is one of our biggest problems or obstacles is we have a bunch of people who can't agree on basic facts. So we have alternative views. Sometimes they're called alternative facts, but I'll say in the context of Buddhism, we have alternative views. And thinking of it in terms of alternative views is really in accord with classical Buddhist philosophy, meaning um, we begin to see craving as a good thing. So we start to get so deeply enmeshed in this thing called dukkha that we don't want to get out. And we sort of double down on, this is actually the right way to be. You have it wrong. So we see craving as a good thing. And we say stuff like, but artists need pain to create. Some of the most beautiful art comes out of this pain. And if we take the pain away, then we won't have art. Um, we see craving as a basic component of our economy. We say greed is good, and if people don't have demand, there can't be supply and demand, and without the demand, it's the same as these kind of thirst you criticized earlier. How's our economy going to operate, right? And then someone inevitably starts throwing labels like socialist and Marxist, and and then we get waylaid. Um, so these things come up as this little tiny ego inside of us struggling to justify our existence, and we fail to make progress. It becomes another obstacle to basic understanding. Um, so how do we get out of the predicament? And the the classical answer is mindfulness. And these days, if you've been in my Dharma talk or you've been near me for a while, you'll hear me say, every time someone says mindfulness, I say, mindful of what? And inevitably, there's silence. So someone's like, oh, I've been practicing more mindfulness. I say, oh, good. Mindful of what? Uh, so we've commoditized the idea of mindfulness to the point where it no longer has meaning. Classically, traditionally, it's generating increasing mindfulness of this thirst in operation. So you want to see when you have a craving and when it isn't satisfied, and then have greater insight into your response to that. Um, that's mindfulness. So that's something you can do all the time. I don't have to sit in meditation, you know, in front of ice cream to recognize. I can say, "Oh, I didn't get it. That's hilarious," um, and not have the suffering. Or I can have a temper tantrum, and of course, these days someone will get it on video. Then I'll go viral. I'll be on the floor. I'm not leaving until I get my ice cream. um, so your reaction can be very different. So this comes up all the time. You can say, "I want the ice cream," but they only have gelato, and then you can cry. Or you can say, "Oh, gelato, that's interesting. I'll try that. This is a new experience. What do you recommend?" And then you aren't suffering. You just have a new experience. "Oh, it was really wonderful. I was expecting the ice cream, but in fact, they have wonderful gelato. Have you tried it?" Everything's happy. Um, Maybe you travel all the way around the world to come to Portland to get a picture of Mount Hood, and you come in the winter and it's raining and you can't see it, and you just take your camera and you dash it on the rocks, and you're like, my whole life this is all I wanted. Or you can say, wow, this is a wholly different landscape. It's so ethereal with the clouds and the tall trees, and I met some wonderful people, and did you know Portland has really great coffee? And then you come away with a different perspective. um, so obstacles, change, adversity is inevitable. Suffering is optional. So this is where mindfulness comes about. It's not inevitable that you will have the suffering. What's inevitable is you will have experienced it at some point. Um, I was actually, I remember as a little kid being slightly disappointed that I couldn't ride on the back of the garbage truck, because that was back when the guys actually rode on the back and they grabbed the metal cans. It looked like a lot of fun. You know, when you're 4, you just want to go on down the alley. Those guys look like they had a lot of fun. So there's a bit of disappointment. But later you can say, oh, well, I don't have to do that. You can do something else. You can experience it in a different way. So dukkha arises only when we react to the circumstances in life. So that doesn't mean that you're wooden, you're just this unfeeling being. It just means you're more flexible. It means you kind of see this process as it's arising, and you don't have to be as reactive. Um, you can find joy and opportunity in other avenues. So let's ask questions then. Um, if you've watched the news in the last week, you've probably seen something that made you upset and probably led us to be disheartened or sad. Um, some of us may even feel rage. We may um, we may be actively in the streets with a sign or a flag or a banner because we feel so moved. So we could ask questions. Does violence end violence? Do disparaging comments encourage others to join your perspective? Does destruction encourage building? So, to be fair, all of these need more detail and description. So, let's go with violence. So, we've seen violence on our televisions, piped into our homes. Um, Violence may be needed to stop violence in the moment, but violence won't ultimately end without acceptance and rehabilitation. So if you tackle a gunman, they're still going to be violent until you can address and touch what led them to be at that location and being violent to begin with. Um, Stopping a fight might require force, but how do you change the aggression? How do you change the aggression within the person? I think this requires additional skill. It requires more. It requires a thing that, especially I think, in at least in the United States, we don't like. It requires more work up front, so that we have less work downstream. Um, and what do I mean by that? How do you get all of these situations that we see, regardless of what your opinion is of them? How did we get there? We got there because what distinguishes, you know, the world today from 50, 60 years ago? We don't give as much time to people to be with their families, right? They're working more. We don't give as much time to and resources to young people and the students. We don't give as much time um, to community connections. Um, I recently read a study that, what was it, in the late 60s, early 70s, there were more bowling teams in America than ever before. And by the late 90s, early 2000s, there were more people bowling, but there were no more teams, right? So something happened where people didn't connect in community. They were doing everything on an individual basis. So these things have changed. And so how we talk to one another and view one another change. We've lost the opportunity to engage in conversation. And then even in during COVID, we don't have the opportunity to have, the water cooler conversation. We don't have the coffee break conversation at work where people from different backgrounds can share, their experience. Um, and people are not taking time on social media to read more than a headline. So this is what I mean when it requires more work up front. So there's less work downstream. So here's me bringing it back to the Bodhisattva has this insight into dukkha. The Bodhisattva sees is not just happening to them, it's happening to others. They recognize that all of these kind of horrible things they see in the world are the result of people's dukkha, right? Their emotional response to discomfort. And they, at that point, see people more equally. They see all of these people rather than individuals as a connected um, group called sentient beings who all have the same experience. And if you look at the translator's note, it gives you the paramitas. So it says, what do you need to engage in the work of assisting all of these sentient beings? You need charity, observation of precepts, patience, zeal or vigor, meditation, and wisdom. So those specific ideas we touched on last class. Um, but this is why the text then picks up. So if you read the end of page 46 going into 47, it says the type of paradoxical expression that we meet with here can most frequently be found in the perfection of wisdom literature. To cite an example similar to the one in our text, a passage from the Dharma Sutra, which belongs to the body of the perfection of wisdom. So it says that the Buddha said, here's Subhuti, someone who has set out in the vehicle of a bodhisattva should produce a thought in this manner. As many beings as there are in the universe of beings, comprehended over the term beings, all these I must lead to nirvana, into that realm of nirvana which leaves nothing behind. And yet, although innumerable beings have thus been led to nirvana, no being at all has been led to nirvana. And why? If in a bodhisattva the notion of a being should take place, he could not be called a bodhi being. And why? He is not to be called a bodhi being in whom the notion of a self or a being should take place, or the notion of a living soul or a person. So let me rephrase that because it's one of Kuntz's translations. It's just a little archaic. To be a bodhisattva, we have to maintain this thought. All beings in all worlds, in whatever form that these beings may take, I must work for their benefit and on their behalf. Although some have been liberated, I must practice as if none have been liberated. Why should I practice this way? As soon as I form the thought of a being that has been liberated, this thought limits my thinking, my conception of what a being is, or who may be worthy of my efforts. I must practice as though their lives depend on it, as though my life depended on it. I must practice as though there is no distinction between myself and other beings. So bodhisattvas cultivate vows, which are the source of the power for saving beings. The vows are considered the basis of your cultivation, the foundation on which your practice is based. There are actually two features here. There's one type of mind that is expansive and recognizes the needs of countless sentient beings. The other is a type of mind that understands the need for persistent effort. So there's two big features in that passage that was translated when the Buddha is talking to Subhuti. So this expansive mind that sees all sentient beings, and then secondarily, that as a result of that realization, there's a mind that understands the need for persistent effort. So I want to read a little bit farther down on the page. It says, because they possessed such great wisdom that could be applied to expedient means in quest of enlightenment, They extinguished their ignorance and perceived the original Dharmakaya, spontaneously performing incomprehensible activities, exercising manifold influences. They pervade everywhere, and their identity was suchness. Nevertheless, they reveal no marks of their influence that can be traced as such. Why? Because the Buddha, the Tathagatas, are no other than the Dharmakaya itself and the embodiment of wisdom. They belong to the realm of the absolute truth that transcends the world where the relative truth operates. They are free from any conventional activities, and yet, because of the fact that sentient beings receive benefit through seeing or hearing about them, their influence of suchness can be spoken of in relative terms. So I'll try to rephrase that too. That's a mouthful. So, due to their great skill, right? Due to the great cultivation of the bodhisattva, they achieve enlightenment by employing wisdom and expedient means to extinguish ignorance. And due to the extinguishment of the ignorance, and if you recall our definition of ignorance from a couple of pages up, the text described it as the state of being destitute of wisdom, right? So they've extinguished the state where they have no wisdom, so now they have wisdom. So because of that, the practitioners perceive the Dharmakaya as the um, natural result of the practice. When active, this Dharmakaya, the Dharma body, this absolute existence, true manifestation of reality, um, this is what they're awakened to. This newly awakened Buddha, in this case, is synonymous with the Dharmakaya, the ultimate absence of ignorance and the full blossoming of truth. So the text is implying that as we gain insight, right, as we practice mindfulness, as we personally gain insight into dukkha, as we see it operating in ourselves, we'll begin to see it operating in other people. And this is an antidote to much of the frustration, anger, and pain that we see in the world. Um, so imagine you're confronted with someone who's screaming and yelling, and they're in a complete fit tirade, and they're in total disagreement with you. As you practice mindfulness, in the moment, it is possible to actually see that process happening inside them. You have this insight, oh, the person's in deep pain. Um, I could probably pinpoint where the pain is coming from. And rather than reflecting the same energy back, it's possible to connect with them, um, and have a different outcome rather than just back and forth arguments. So, who does this professionally? The hostage negotiator, right? Um, we see this in the movies, but in reality, a lot of times that's what's happening. Um, high stress situations reveal a lot of pain that people are in, and if you can pinpoint the pain and discuss that rather than the manifestation of the pain, um, counselors do it, de-escalating situations. A lot of times teachers are able to do it with students when they're, understanding. I've seen this kid when they're at their best. I know something emotional happened and they're at their worst at the moment. But by connecting with their humanity, rather than attaching to the emotion, there's a different outcome, and you see people differently. We, as human beings, we're good at this when it comes to people we care about or situations we're familiar with. We're not as good when with surprise confrontations or when we think we're right. It's hard for us to let go of the emotional side of an argument when we think, or we may even know we're correct and somebody else is wrong. Um, and we're there's a bit of a, I guess, probably more so within the United States than other parts of North America, but there's a bit of the cowboy where we think we need to let everybody know we're right rather than just focusing on the need of the other person. Sometimes we feel like we need to argue the point. So then we get caught up more in the emotion. So when the text is talking about skillful means, this is one of those skillful means. Um, Having the insight, right? What's the purpose of meditation? You can take it off the cushion. It travels with you all the time. Um, it's always available. It's not limited to something that you just do while you're sitting. It's something you can carry forward in the difficult holiday dinner conversation with that one uncle that just won't let that point go, and maybe allow you to change their perspective a little bit. But it's done not by arguing back, it's finding commonality. Just like the Bodhisattva sees the commonality of everybody's experiencing this. I've experienced this. I experienced it differently, but it's the same function, the same, it manifests differently, but the underlying function is the same. Okay. So if you read down a little bit further on that page, there's a translator's note. Um, and the translator's note says the double standards of truth, one being the absolute truth, the other the relative truth, have played an important role in Mahayana Buddhism. The explanations of the double set of truth can vary from school to school, but we can find a classical exposition of them in Nagarjuna. His verse on the topic reads as follows. Oop, there goes my microphone. I'm fighting the train rumble. Okay, we passed. Um, Elucidation of the Dharma doctrine of the Buddha is on the basis of twofold truth. One is the worldly truth, the other the ultimate truth. Those who do not know the distinction between these types of truth do not know the profound truth in the instruction of the Buddha. So we have two Sanskrit terms. So we have to try to translate or um, give a little bit of insight. So the first one is Samvarti Satya, and this is the conventional truth. So the conventional truth is how we right now see and understand reality. It is how we experience life from day to day. It's the ordinary understanding of things. It's the standpoint of us seeing things, labeling, making distinctions and separations. So this is how um, we see the world. And the distinction here is made because the Buddhas are in a completely different category or state of understanding and experience. And in order for them to communicate the ultimate truth, they have to communicate it through this provisional or conventional truth. So they have to talk to us and use language that is imperfect. So one of the reasons sometimes we struggle with Buddhist texts is some of the ideas have been translated through multiple languages, and we could be thrown off very easily by one word. So we spent quite a while just talking about dukkha and wrapping our heads around that idea separate from how it's often translated or how it's often kind of left for us to encounter. So the Buddhas have this broad understanding, and they have to use a very imperfect vehicle to express this knowledge. So um, we're getting our medicine in a way um, watered down, and they're aware of that. The other um, the other term there, paramartha sattva, is the ultimate truth. So it's understanding that is experienced by the Buddhas. This interdependence, this constant um, interconnected viewpoint, which is difficult um, for us to grasp and work with all the time. So, why is it important to distinguish the two? One, inevitably, I think it comes up with regard to how the teachings presented and practices. So, without going into the kind of super detailed philosophy class explanation, I'll try to put it this way. The bodhisattvas have to use something to teach us. And the best thing to use is what's immediately around us. So they're trying to skillfully lead us provisionally toward the ultimate. And in the process, they've got to use imperfect tools. So um, they want to get us to Disney World, but all that's available is an old bus. But the old bus holds all of us. So we get in and we have to patch it up and we have to learn how to maintain it and change tires and, radiator hoses and all of those things are provisional truths, right? The, the Buddhas ultimately have no use for the radiator hose, battery, and spare tire. Provisionally, temporarily, it's very important. Um, and I think if we look at it too from the perspective of practices, one of the things that we in the West struggle with are practices we've been given from the Asian origin of Buddhism. And sometimes we point out, or are prone to point out, or you will read about cultural baggage that we perceive in a particular practice or tradition. And I think it's helpful to note we should be careful, kind of from with our Western gaze, as we look at these practices, to observe all of this is provisional truth, but there's a purpose and a benefit. So we shouldn't just cast it aside because we've labeled it, oh, that's cultural baggage, or that's not useful. We need to really look at what is it teaching us, and are we getting that teaching or experience any other way, or are we throwing away um, the experience? I think anybody who's spent time in Asia, especially around Buddhist temples, will see a lot of practices that are not done here or to the same degree, and sometimes they wonder about that. Um, these practices can be useful, but they have to be engaged with. And it's difficult to assess their usefulness by just looking at them from the outside. It's something that really has to be um, practiced. It has to be something you really get involved with. Since we're still in the Obon season, I'll give you an example. In um, in Japan, part of the season is the Bon dance, and one of the translations of the Ulanbana Sutra Um, says the Buddha's disciple, when he does the prayers and liberates his mother from the ghost realm, was so happy that he danced, kind of danced with joy spontaneously. And culturally, in Japan, dance was a religious expression prior to the um, introduction of Buddhism. So it was logical, it was natural for people to read this, think of their own current cultural expression, and connect the two. So it becomes this beautiful expression. So I can't express through words the experience you have when you're dancing, right? Dance is something that transcends language. Um, across cultures, different dances transcend language. But the doing of it is transformative to the individual in the same way that a lot of the practices we have um, within Buddhism are transformative and help us process this, what can sometimes feel like very difficult or terse teaching. So I've said before, I was always surprised when um, I would run into other foreigners on Koyasan, and they always remark how different the place is and how they're changed by it, or whatever their expectation, it um, dramatically changes your expectation. So it's been almost 4 years ago now, a little bit over 4 years ago. I took a group to Japan, and one of my friends, one of my classmates, came with me, and he was really only on the trip for the food. He really not would not consider himself Buddhist, and you know, primary motivation was a little bit of interest in culture and history and architecture, but mainly eating. Um, and so we stayed 2 nights on Koyasan, and the thing that he noticed right away was how kind people were. And I remember somebody gave him the wrist beads, and he was amazed that they just gave it to them and seemed very happy about it. And for years since, he has felt like no one here in town or in this country has taken as much interest in if he was okay or just how he was feeling. He even did an experiment. He stopped going to his yoga class to see if anyone would notice he was gone. Um, because he wondered, does anybody actually care? Um, I remember him calling and saying, it's been 6 weeks. I haven't gotten an email, a text, or anything. So and he was like, it's so different from what he experienced in Japan. So there's the connection, the actual lived experience of this teaching is something that transcends the words. And so when it's talking about the two truths here, that ultimate truth can be pointed at through words and actions, but the feeling, the experience is something that transcends the words. So that's what we're getting at here with the two truths. So as I mentioned before, later in the text in the Awakening of Faith, we get into practices, but these practices are being hinted at throughout. Our mindfulness practice is focused on observing and seeing the process of dukkha, of learning not to react, of developing awareness that is happening in other people, sometimes in the midst of difficult situations, and that's very transformative. So that's, in my opinion, um, when we face difficult situations, um, sharing that part of ourselves, um, genuine connection is more effective for bringing people together than uh, screaming and yelling or arguing back or labeling people with disparaging terms regarding their political perspectives or um, putting everyone in a basket together and they're all the same, this kind of thing. So but it's hard. It's hard. It's something we have to practice so that we can actually um, see it and feel it, and that takes it does take time. So, I think we have a little bit of time. Do some guided meditation. Before we do that, I'll just ask if there are any questions